In the quiet streets of New York City during the mid-1970s, when the neon signs flickered softly and the distant hum of traffic merged with the occasional wail of a siren, there existed a presence that few truly understood. It was not loud, not ostentatious, and certainly not the kind of power that demanded attention with flashy displays or dramatic gestures. Instead, it was the power that spoke in whispers, the kind that moved through smoky back rooms and quiet offices, where deals were struck without the clatter of headlines or the intrusion of the public eye. This was the world of Carlo Gambino, a man whose influence stretched across Brooklyn and Manhattan, yet whose voice remained almost unheard, whose presence was felt more than it was seen. To outsiders, he was a shadow. To those who operated in the delicate dance of organized crime, he was a force whose very silence could command obedience and respect. The story of Carlo Gambino is not one of boisterous declarations or sensationalized violence. It is a tale of measured steps, patient observation, and strategic foresight, qualities that allowed him to rise from the crowded immigrant neighborhoods of Brooklyn to become the undisputed head of one of the most powerful crime families in the United States. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he never relied on intimidation through spectacle. Instead, he cultivated an aura of calm authority, a presence that inspired both loyalty and fear without ever needing to raise his voice. Even in a world defined by aggression and danger, Gambino understood that silence could be louder than any gunshot, that careful calculation often outweighed reckless action, and that the true measure of power lay not in visibility, but in subtle control. As we journey into his world, imagine a city alive yet subdued at night. Street lamps cast pools of golden light over empty sidewalks, and the soft rustle of leaves from an occasional breeze is punctuated by distant conversations spilling from late-night diners or small bars tucked into quiet corners. Here, in these unassuming environments, some of the most consequential decisions in the history of organized crime were made. Behind closed doors in these very neighborhoods, alliances were formed and rivalries simmered, with Gambino sitting quietly, listening intently, always weighing the consequences of every word, every gesture. His mind operated like a chessboard, seeing moves ahead where others saw only the immediate chaos of street life. Carlo Gambino's power was as much psychological as it was operational. Those who met him in person often described an unremarkable man at first glance, a modest figure who spoke softly, with deliberate diction, revealing little of the storm that raged beneath his composed exterior. He had the uncanny ability to command a room without dominating it, to shift outcomes without issuing orders, to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. People learned that a single, quiet word from Gambino could redirect the trajectory of an ambitious lieutenant, defuse potential conflict between rival factions, or seal a business deal that could make or break fortunes. It was this mastery of subtle influence that would eventually elevate him above all others, establishing him as the man who never needed to speak loudly to be heard. In understanding Gambino's rise, one must first understand the world he navigated, a world layered with codes, traditions, and unwritten rules, rooted deeply in Sicilian heritage yet adapted to the harsh realities of New York City. For those on the outside, the mafia appeared as a network of criminals defined by violence and greed. For insiders, it was a complex system of trust, honor, and loyalty, where reputation was currency and every action was measured against a backdrop of consequences that could be fatal. Gambino entered this world not with flamboyant ambition but with careful calculation. He observed, he learned, and he waited. Where others might have rushed into confrontation, he assessed, calculated, and executed with precision. His silence was both shield and sword, allowing him to move through treacherous waters without exposing himself to unnecessary danger. Even at night, in the quiet moments when the city seemed almost asleep, Gambino's influence was pervasive. Neighborhoods whispered his name, and the most cautious operatives in the underworld deferred to his judgment. It was a paradox, a man of few words who had the capacity to shape the lives of hundreds, even thousands, through the power of reputation, careful planning, and a deep understanding of human nature. This duality, quiet yet formidable, formed the core of his legend, and it is here, in these subtleties, that his story captivates even decades later. Unlike the dramatic gunfights and brazen heists that often dominate the imagination of the public, Gambino's empire was built on patience, perception, and the ability to orchestrate outcomes without drawing unnecessary attention. He understood that true control was exercised behind the curtain, in moments invisible to those outside the inner circle. As we begin to explore the life of Carlo Gambino, imagine the texture of the city around him, the cold stone of Brooklyn brownstones, the smell of fresh bread from corner bakeries in the early morning, the distant clang of the subway beneath the streets. In these ordinary settings, extraordinary events unfolded. Every meeting he attended, every handshake exchanged, every glance observed carried weight. And yet, all of this was wrapped in a calm exterior, a life lived with deliberate pacing, a life that demanded patience and discretion in equal measure. To Gambino, power was not demonstrated through spectacle, it was accrued through careful observation, strategic timing, and an almost uncanny sense of when to act and when to remain silent. The fascination with Carlo Gambino endures not merely because of the empire he commanded, but because of the manner in which he commanded it. There is a subtle, almost meditative quality to his story. As we recount his life, the quiet rhythm of the narrative itself mirrors the way he operated, a slow, deliberate unfolding, where each detail matters, where each action has consequence, and where the greatest power often resides in what is not said. For those who listen, it is an invitation to witness the hidden machinery of influence, to understand that in a world governed by chaos and danger, a calm mind and patient observation can wield more power than any display of force. And so, as the night deepens over New York, with shadows stretching long across the empty avenues, we begin our journey into the world of Carlo Gambino. A man who understood the language of silence, the potency of patience, and the quiet authority that could command an entire city without raising a single voice. As we move forward, we will uncover the streets that shaped him, the alliances that defined him, and the legacy that continues to echo through the hidden corridors of organized crime. What happened next would shock even his allies, not through loud confrontation, but through the subtle, decisive moves of a man who always spoke softly, yet whose influence could never be ignored. Long before Carlo Gambino became a name whispered in the shadowed corners of New York City, long before he orchestrated quiet empires and earned the respect of some of the most dangerous men in the world, he was a child of Palermo, Sicily. Picture the narrow, winding streets of early 20th century Palermo, sun-bleached and dusty during the day, yet alive with murmurs and the scent of baking bread as evening fell. Children played in the alleys, barefoot and laughing, while merchants called out their wares from crowded stalls, and the distant bells of churches marked the passing hours. In this world, tradition and family were everything. Social hierarchies were visible in subtle gestures, in the respect shown to elders, in the way neighbors observed each other with quiet scrutiny. It was a place where loyalty was prized above ambition, where one's actions carried consequences not just for oneself, but for the entire family. Carlo was born in 1902 into a modest household. His family, like many in Palermo at the time, faced the daily struggles of poverty and limited opportunity. The streets were both playground and classroom, teaching lessons that no school could provide. Young Carlo watched carefully, observing interactions and noting the unspoken rules that governed life in his neighborhood. He saw how disputes could escalate into violence if left unchecked, how reputation could protect or endanger a man, and how the quietest individuals often held the most influence. Even in these early years, it became clear that Carlo Gambino had a keen sense of observation, a patience that allowed him to learn more from watching than from acting impulsively. Life in Palermo also meant exposure to the traditions and the darker undercurrents of Sicilian society. Organized crime, though less structured than the mafia he would later lead in New York, had deep roots in the culture, familial alliances, codes of honor, and a rigid sense of loyalty. Carlo would have seen older men negotiating disputes, protecting their families, and occasionally engaging in acts that skirted legality. These were not stories of flamboyant criminals but of careful, strategic individuals who understood the delicate balance of respect, fear, and influence. For a young boy growing up in these streets, such observations were lessons in human behavior, in power that could be wielded quietly and decisively. It is here, in the sun-soaked alleys and crowded markets of Palermo, that the seeds of his later philosophy began to take root: observe first, act second, and always measure the consequences of one's actions. Education in Palermo was a mixture of formal schooling and life lessons learned on the streets. Carlo, like many children of his neighborhood, attended small local schools, where literacy and numeracy were taught alongside the expectation of respect for teachers and elders. Yet the real education came outside the classroom, in the interactions that taught him about negotiation, persuasion, and the subtle art of reading people. A merchant haggling over the price of olives, a neighbor settling a dispute quietly with words rather than blows, these were the examples that would inform his understanding of power. From an early age, he learned that influence could be more potent than force, and that those who controlled outcomes often did so not through visible strength, but through intelligence, timing, and restraint. Family life was central to Carlo's upbringing. In Palermo, households were close-knit, and each member contributed to the survival and prosperity of the family. Carlo's parents instilled in him a sense of duty and responsibility, emphasizing the importance of loyalty, discretion, and honor. These values would later manifest in the way he conducted business, in the alliances he formed, and in the strict codes of conduct he enforced within his organization. Yet within the warmth and structure of family life, there was also exposure to the harsh realities of survival. Poverty demanded resilience, and resilience demanded careful planning. Carlo learned early that life could be unforgiving, and that those who failed to understand the rules, spoken and unspoken, often paid a steep price. The streets of Palermo were alive with color, noise, and activity, yet they also held shadows, quiet corners where danger could emerge unexpectedly. Carlo's early experiences were marked by contrasts, moments of playful laughter with friends juxtaposed against tense interactions among adults, where a wrong word or misstep could provoke conflict. These contrasts shaped his worldview, teaching him to navigate situations with caution and foresight. He observed the dynamics of power not as a child seeking adventure, but as a young strategist, noticing patterns, understanding hierarchies, and learning when silence could be more effective than speech. The ability to blend into the background, to watch without being seen, became an instinct that would define his approach for decades to come. Even as a child, Carlo displayed traits that set him apart. Where some of his peers might have been drawn to attention or brash action, he seemed naturally attuned to the subtleties of human behavior. He noticed how a simple gesture could convey respect or defiance, how timing in conversation could influence outcomes, and how patience often outweighed immediate gratification. These early lessons were not learned through formal instruction but through careful observation of the world around him. By the time he was a teenager, he had developed a nuanced understanding of how influence worked, and a remarkable ability to predict the actions of others based on their temperament and desires. As political and economic conditions in Sicily shifted during the early decades of the 20th century, opportunities and pressures mounted for young men like Carlo. Many sought escape from poverty and limited prospects, drawn to the promise of a new life abroad. Stories of America, of bustling cities, opportunity, and wealth, circulated through the streets, carried by returning travelers or letters from distant relatives. It was against this backdrop that Carlo's path began to tilt toward migration, a step that would take him far from the familiar streets of Palermo but would carry the lessons of his youth into a completely new world. Yet even as he prepared to leave, the city and its rhythms remained imprinted in him, the sounds, the smells, the subtle cues of power and influence, the lessons of discretion and observation. Palermo was not merely a birthplace, it was the formative landscape of his understanding of life, loyalty, and authority. The decision to leave Sicily for America was not merely a flight from hardship, but an opportunity to apply the knowledge he had accumulated over years of careful observation. He carried with him a deep respect for family, an understanding of social dynamics, and a growing awareness that patience and strategy could achieve what impulsiveness could not. In the quiet streets of Palermo, he had learned that true power was invisible until it struck, that those who commanded respect often did so with subtlety rather than noise, and that survival depended on both intellect and timing. These early experiences shaped not only the man he would become but also the philosophy that would guide his actions in a world far larger, more complex, and far more dangerous than the streets of his youth. As night fell over Palermo, with lanterns casting soft glows over the narrow alleys and the air carrying the faint scent of baking bread and salt from the nearby coast, one could imagine young Carlo walking thoughtfully through the city, absorbing its lessons. Each shadowed doorway, each quiet conversation, each glance exchanged on the street contributed to the framework of understanding he would carry to New York. These moments of observation, these small imprints of experience, were the foundation upon which he would build a life of extraordinary influence. From these humble beginnings, a man would emerge who could command loyalty, negotiate power, and shape outcomes without ever needing to shout. The child of Palermo was destined to become the silent Don of New York, a man whose very presence carried the weight of authority, even in the absence of sound. The journey from Palermo to New York was both a physical and a psychological transformation for Carlo Gambino, a passage that would take him from the narrow, sun-drenched alleys of his childhood to the crowded, cacophonous streets of an immigrant city pulsing with possibility and danger. Imagine the scene as he stepped off the crowded docks of Ellis Island, the salty air mingling with the scent of coal smoke and distant industries, the cries of vendors and the chatter of families blending into a rhythmic, chaotic welcome to a land that promised both opportunity and peril. For many immigrants, the streets of New York were harsh and unrelenting, a maze of brick tenements, crowded markets, and factories, each offering the potential for work, survival, or misfortune. For Carlo, however, these streets were also a classroom, teaching lessons in resilience, observation, and the unspoken rules of a society where ambition and caution had to coexist. Brooklyn, in the 1920s, was a city of contrasts. Italian neighborhoods were vibrant and noisy, alive with the smells of fresh bread, simmering sauces, and the occasional tang of smoke from nearby factories. Children played in narrow alleys, weaving around laundry hung between buildings, their laughter echoing against the brownstones. But beneath this apparent normalcy lurked tensions, territorial disputes between families, petty crimes, and a constant awareness of law enforcement that could be both intrusive and unpredictable. For Carlo, this environment was both familiar and challenging. The cultural codes of Sicily were transplanted into these streets, creating pockets of community where loyalty and reputation were paramount, yet the scale and complexity of New York's immigrant life required adaptation, subtlety, and an instinct for reading people and situations with acute precision. Carlo's early years in Brooklyn were marked by a delicate balance between assimilation and preservation. He observed carefully, learning to navigate the dense social networks of the Italian-American community. Each interaction, each minor conflict, offered insights into human behavior, alliances, and the hierarchies that governed both family life and street life. It was here that he began to understand that influence was often wielded quietly, through gestures, timing, and reputation rather than through overt displays of force. He noticed how a simple act of respect could earn loyalty, how a momentary lapse in judgment could provoke lasting consequences, and how the subtleties of conversation could shape outcomes as decisively as any confrontation. These early lessons would become the bedrock of his philosophy. In a world of constant unpredictability, observation and patience were more valuable than impulsive action. Work and survival were integral to life in Brooklyn for immigrant families, and Carlo's youth was no exception. He took on various jobs, often in the shadow of legal and illegal economies. The streets taught him lessons in negotiation, risk assessment, and discretion. Small favors, errands that skirted the edges of legality offered opportunities to observe human behavior in high-stakes situations. Every interaction, whether a merchant haggling, a neighbor mediating a dispute, or a competitor asserting control, provided Carlo with insights into power, influence, and the value of patience. His natural acuity allowed him to discern motives and intentions quickly, a skill that would later prove invaluable in navigating the intricate networks of organized crime. The immigrant neighborhoods of Brooklyn also exposed Carlo to early forms of organized crime that were already taking root in America. Italian-American families had transplanted certain traditions and structures from Sicily, adapting them to the opportunities and pressures of urban life. Gambling operations, numbers rackets, protection schemes, these existed quietly alongside legitimate businesses, interwoven into the fabric of community life. Carlo observed these systems with careful interest, recognizing both their risks and their potential. Unlike others who might have rushed into participation, he studied first, weighing the personalities involved, understanding the stakes, and assessing the reliability of those in power. This cautious, measured approach would define him, allowing him to navigate a treacherous world without unnecessary exposure or reckless moves. Social dynamics in Brooklyn were intricate, and Carlo quickly learned the importance of alliances and loyalty. Trust was a currency more valuable than money, and betrayal could have consequences that echoed far beyond a single individual. Even as a young man, Carlo displayed an instinctive understanding of these dynamics. He watched the interactions of elders and peers alike, noting patterns of behavior, moments of negotiation, and subtle signals of authority or submission. These observations taught him that influence could be exerted without confrontation, that power was often the result of perception rather than force, and that the ability to remain calm and deliberate in tense situations was a hallmark of those destined to rise above the rest. Life in Brooklyn was not without its dangers, and Carlo's formative years were punctuated by moments that required both courage and discretion. Street fights, territorial disputes, and encounters with local authorities served as reminders that survival depended on more than physical strength. It depended on timing, judgment, and an understanding of human behavior. Carlo learned to read the mood of a room, the intentions behind a glance, and the subtle cues that could indicate loyalty or threat. He understood early that one's reputation was as vital as any tangible resource, and that the ability to navigate social networks with discretion could mean the difference between advancement and disaster. Education, formal and informal, played a role in shaping Carlo's understanding of the world. While he attended local schools and learned the basics of literacy and numeracy, the true lessons came from the streets, from the neighborhoods, and from interactions that tested both his judgment and his patience. These experiences honed his analytical mind, teaching him to think several steps ahead and to anticipate the reactions of others. Where other young men might have been drawn to immediate gratification or flashy displays of power, Carlo learned the value of restraint, observation, and quiet strategy. Every encounter, no matter how minor, became an opportunity to refine his understanding of influence and control. Family remained central to his life in Brooklyn. His parents, like many immigrants, emphasized hard work, respect for elders, and the importance of maintaining family honor. Carlo internalized these lessons, understanding that loyalty and discretion were not merely moral imperatives, but practical tools for survival and advancement. His upbringing reinforced the idea that power could be exercised without spectacle, that subtlety could achieve what brute force could not, and that the bonds of trust within a community could be leveraged to build influence. These principles, learned in the intimate context of family life, would guide him as he navigated the more expansive and dangerous networks of organized crime that awaited him. Brooklyn's streets were alive with activity, yet Carlo's approach was always deliberate. He watched, listened, and absorbed, developing a keen sense for timing and opportunity. He recognized that in a city of constant motion, those who acted rashly often fell behind, while those who waited, observed, and moved with precision could rise quietly yet powerfully. This understanding became the foundation of his strategy: patience and perception over impulsiveness, subtlety over spectacle, calculation over confrontation. The city itself became a living classroom, teaching lessons in influence, negotiation, and survival that would serve him for decades. By the time Carlo Gambino reached young adulthood in Brooklyn, he had already internalized the lessons of Palermo, adapted them to the complex environment of New York, and begun to apply them in ways that set him apart from his peers. He understood that survival and success were about more than physical presence; they were about perception, timing, and the careful accumulation of influence. In the quiet corners of crowded streets, in the subtle exchanges of glances and gestures, he honed the skills that would eventually allow him to rise to the pinnacle of organized crime. And as night fell over Brooklyn, with the distant lights of Manhattan shimmering across the East River, one could imagine Carlo walking thoughtfully along familiar streets, contemplating his next steps, learning, observing, and preparing for a future that would transform him from a Sicilian immigrant boy into one of the most powerful men in America. As Carlo Gambino settled into the rhythm of life in Brooklyn, the boundaries between ordinary existence and the shadowed undercurrents of the city became increasingly apparent. The streets, vibrant and noisy during the day, often whispered their secrets at night, and Carlo, ever observant, learned to distinguish between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between what could be ignored and what demanded attention. It was in these subtle distinctions that the first seeds of his criminal involvement took root. Unlike many who rushed headlong into reckless acts, Carlo approached each opportunity with the careful deliberation of someone who understood the long game, someone who measured risk and reward with quiet precision. His early steps into crime were not grand or violent, they were measured, almost imperceptible, yet they laid the foundation for a lifetime of influence. The early 1920s in Brooklyn were a time of opportunity for those willing to navigate the blurred lines between legality and criminal enterprise. Italian-American neighborhoods were hubs of small-scale operations, numbers games, illicit loans, smuggling, and protection schemes flourished alongside legitimate businesses. Carlo began to involve himself in these activities in minor roles, often performing errands, observing the workings of local operators, and assisting with discreet tasks. He understood that visibility could be dangerous, that mistakes were costly, and that reputation, once earned, could protect or endanger a person in equal measure. From the outset, he was meticulous, learning the nuances of human behavior and the subtle power dynamics that governed every interaction. One of Carlo's first experiences with organized crime came through involvement in the numbers racket, a form of gambling deeply ingrained in the Italian-American neighborhoods of Brooklyn. The game was simple in concept but complex in execution, requiring careful coordination, secrecy, and trust among participants. Carlo's role may have seemed minor, collecting bets, delivering messages, and observing the behavior of both customers and operators, but it was in these small, seemingly insignificant tasks that he honed the skills that would define his later career. He learned to read people quickly, to anticipate the motivations of those around him, and to recognize opportunities that others might overlook. These lessons were crucial, teaching him that influence was often exercised not through brute force but through understanding and manipulation of human behavior. At the same time, Carlo began to attract the attention of local mentors, experienced figures in the neighborhood who recognized his intelligence, patience, and discretion. These men, themselves enmeshed in the early stages of organized crime, offered guidance, introduced him to more complex operations, and subtly tested his abilities. Carlo approached these relationships with respect, carefully observing the lessons imparted while weighing the character and intentions of his mentors. He understood that alliances could be both protective and dangerous, that loyalty was valuable but rare, and that every interaction carried long-term consequences. This period was formative, not because of any grandiose criminal exploits, but because it taught him the foundational skills of trust, observation, and strategic patience. Carlo's first encounters with law enforcement also occurred during this period, though they were relatively minor. Arrests for petty theft or involvement in gambling operations were common in Brooklyn, and young men like Carlo quickly learned that caution and discretion were essential. Unlike more impulsive individuals, Carlo internalized these experiences, viewing them not as setbacks but as opportunities to refine his understanding of risk and consequence. He became adept at maintaining a low profile, at avoiding unnecessary attention, and at ensuring that his involvement remained subtle and strategic. These early brushes with the law reinforced his belief in patience and planning, reinforcing a philosophy that would guide him throughout his life, that survival and success required foresight, careful calculation, and the ability to operate in the shadows. By the mid-1920s, Carlo's reputation as a reliable and discreet operator began to grow. He was no longer simply a participant in minor activities, he was becoming a trusted figure within his local network. His ability to execute tasks with precision, maintain confidentiality, and observe the intricate dynamics of the street earned him respect. Yet he remained cautious, never seeking notoriety or overt displays of power. He understood that in a world defined by reputation and subtle influence, the most dangerous mistakes were often those made in haste, in anger, or in pursuit of recognition. This understanding became a hallmark of his approach, distinguishing him from contemporaries who relied on boldness and aggression to assert dominance. During these years, Carlo also began to form relationships with other young men who would later play pivotal roles in the mafia. These connections were not formed through reckless ambition but through careful observation, shared experiences, and mutual respect. He identified individuals whose character, intelligence, and discretion aligned with his own values, laying the groundwork for alliances that would later prove instrumental in his rise. These early bonds were subtle yet profound, forming networks of trust that extended into the more complex operations of the 1930s and beyond. Carlo understood that the strength of these relationships would ultimately be as important as any individual skill or act of cunning, for loyalty and trust were the currency of survival in the criminal underworld. Even as he engaged in these early activities, Carlo maintained a remarkable level of composure and foresight. Unlike many young men drawn to the thrill of crime, he exhibited patience, restraint, and a strategic mindset. He observed carefully, anticipating the actions of others and weighing the long-term implications of every choice. His ability to blend into the background while simultaneously absorbing critical information became one of his greatest assets. This period of careful engagement allowed him to develop a reputation as a man who could be relied upon to act decisively when necessary, yet who would never expose himself to unnecessary risk, a combination of traits that would become the foundation of his leadership style. By the late 1920s, Carlo's immersion in these minor criminal operations had given him a deep understanding of the mechanics of organized crime. He knew the value of patience, the importance of alliances, and the subtle art of influence. He understood the social codes that governed behavior within the Italian-American community, the unspoken rules that dictated loyalty and honor, and the psychological strategies that allowed one to maintain control without resorting to overt aggression. Every errand, every small transaction, every observation contributed to his growing mastery of these skills. He was no longer simply a participant in crime, he was a student of its intricacies, learning lessons that could not be taught in books or classrooms, lessons that would serve him in the decades to come. In reflecting on these formative years, it becomes clear that Carlo Gambino's early criminal activities were not defined by violence or spectacle, but by discipline, observation, and careful strategy. His experiences in Brooklyn's immigrant neighborhoods provided him with a practical education in human behavior, negotiation, and the subtle mechanisms of power. He learned that influence was often exercised quietly, that reputation and trust could be leveraged more effectively than intimidation, and that patience and foresight were invaluable assets in a world where miscalculation could be fatal. These lessons, absorbed gradually and applied judiciously, set the stage for his eventual rise to the pinnacle of organized crime, demonstrating that true power often emerges not from bold displays, but from quiet mastery of the world around you. By the time Carlo Gambino reached his mid-20s, the foundations of his future empire were firmly in place. He had cultivated networks of trust, honed his understanding of human behavior, and learned to operate with discretion and precision. He had navigated the early challenges of street life, minor legal troubles, and the complex social dynamics of Brooklyn's Italian-American neighborhoods with remarkable skill. And though his actions remained largely invisible to the wider world, his reputation within the community of operators was growing steadily. The young man who once walked the sunlit streets of Palermo had become a figure of quiet competence in Brooklyn, preparing silently, patiently, and deliberately for a future that would elevate him far beyond the neighborhood corners he had once roamed. In these formative years, the lessons of observation, patience, and discretion were not merely survival strategies, they were the blueprint for the life of influence and authority that would eventually define Carlo Gambino. The early 1930s in New York City were a time of turbulence and quiet violence, a period when the underworld of organized crime was convulsed by a struggle for dominance that would later be remembered as the Castellamarese War. This conflict, named after the Sicilian town of Castellammare del Golfo, from which many of the combatants had emigrated, was more than a battle of individual ambition, it was a war of loyalties, heritage, and control over the lucrative rackets that defined the Italian-American neighborhoods of Brooklyn, Manhattan, and beyond. For a young Carlo Gambino, this was a moment of profound observation, of subtle maneuvering, and of the kind of strategic patience that would distinguish him from those swept up in the chaos around him. Imagine the city at night during this period. Streets dimly lit by flickering lamps, alleys thick with the scent of coal and smoke, the occasional distant gunshot punctuating the rhythm of everyday life. In these conditions, the mafia families moved in quiet but lethal ways. Ambitions clashed, alliances shifted, and old grudges erupted with deadly consequences. The world that Carlo had been preparing for 3 years of careful observation, discreet errands, and early criminal engagement was now unfolding in its most visceral form. Unlike others who relied on impulse or brute force, Carlo remained measured, assessing each development, noting the strengths and weaknesses of potential allies and adversaries, and always considering the long-term implications of each violent episode. The Castellamarese War itself was sparked by the simmering rivalry between two factions of Italian-American crime families, the faction led by Joe Masuria, a figure whose reputation was built on fear and aggressive displays of power, and the opposing faction led by Salvatore Maranzano, a man determined to consolidate control over the fragmented rackets of the city. Each faction sought to assert dominance over gambling operations, extortion networks, and the increasingly profitable labor rackets. Streets and neighborhoods became arenas of calculated terror, where allegiances were tested, and loyalty was bought or enforced through intimidation. For Carlo, witnessing these conflicts was both a lesson and a warning. The reckless could rise quickly, but they could also fall just as swiftly. Survival, he understood, demanded foresight, subtlety, and the careful cultivation of relationships. During this period, Carlo Gambino did not thrust himself into the spotlight of violence. Instead, he operated with the precision of an observer-scholar, noting the movements of each family, the patterns of conflict, and the responses of law enforcement. The city itself became a living classroom, where every confrontation, every assassination, and every strategic maneuver offered insight into power and control. He learned the importance of timing, of knowing when to act and when to remain unseen. He saw the fatal consequences of impulsive behavior, the vulnerabilities created by arrogance, and the ways in which reputation could be leveraged or destroyed. The lessons of these years would prove invaluable, shaping his philosophy that influence was more enduring than fear, and patience often outweighed aggression. The chaos of the Castellamarese War also revealed the fragility of alliances and the complexity of loyalty. Carlo watched as friendships fractured under pressure, as men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder turned on each other for personal gain or survival. In this environment, trust was precious and rare, and Carlo learned to cultivate it with care, testing the character of those around him before forming bonds. He observed how strategic patience could protect an individual even amid widespread violence and how discretion often allowed one to navigate dangerous waters with minimal exposure. These lessons reinforced his natural inclination toward observation and restraint, providing a framework for the calculated approach to power that would define his future. One of the defining features of Carlo's conduct during this period was his ability to move quietly through dangerous networks without attracting undue attention. While others engaged in open displays of aggression, Gambino's skill lay in his subtlety. He aligned with influential figures when necessary, distanced himself from unnecessary conflict, and built connections that would serve as a foundation for his eventual rise. He understood that visibility could be deadly in times of war and that the most effective operators were often those whose influence was felt indirectly, through careful negotiation and strategic positioning rather than overt violence. In essence, Carlo was learning to be a master of the shadows, absorbing lessons in strategy that could not be replicated through force alone. The period also offered insights into the management of fear, both as a weapon and as a shield. Carlo observed how leaders like Masuria and Maranzano wielded intimidation to command obedience, but he also noted the vulnerabilities that came with reliance on terror. Fear could enforce loyalty temporarily, but it often bred resentment and betrayal, a lesson that Carlo internalized fully. By contrast, influence built on respect, strategic alliances, and subtle manipulation created stability that could endure beyond the fleeting effects of intimidation. He began to see that the greatest leaders were those who understood not only the external threats but also the psychological currents within their networks, a comprehension that would later define his leadership style. Despite the omnipresent danger, Carlo's ability to remain calm, composed, and calculating allowed him to survive while others fell. He learned to interpret the signals of violence, the way a sudden death shifted the balance of power, the subtle repositioning of allies, and the emergence of new opportunities from the chaos of conflict. In these years, he became acutely aware of the importance of foresight and timing, understanding that immediate action without consideration of long-term consequences could be fatal. His discretion became a shield, his patience a weapon, and his observation a tool that allowed him to navigate a turbulent and deadly landscape without succumbing to the pitfalls that ensnared many of his peers. As the Castellamarese War drew to a close with the elimination of Joe Masuria and the subsequent reorganization under Salvatore Maranzano, Carlo Gambino emerged not as a headline figure, but as a quietly respected operative whose reputation for discretion, intelligence, and loyalty had been forged under fire. He had witnessed the consequences of reckless ambition, the importance of strategic alliances, and the subtle mechanisms by which power could be accrued and maintained. The chaos that had engulfed New York's underworld had also provided him with the opportunity to refine his skills, build relationships, and understand the intricacies of leadership in a perilous environment. By the end of this turbulent chapter, Carlo's approach to the world had crystallized. He would eschew unnecessary violence, favoring strategic patience over impulsive action. He would cultivate loyalty and trust carefully, understanding that these intangible assets were as valuable as any tangible resource. He would observe first, act second, and always consider the long-term consequences of each decision. The lessons of the Castellamarese War were not merely about survival, they were about mastery. They taught him how to operate in a world defined by uncertainty, danger, and shifting loyalties, and they laid the foundation for the quiet but formidable power he would wield in the decades to come. In reflecting on Carlo Gambino's experience during these years, it becomes evident that his genius was not in the violence he avoided but in the subtlety, patience, and foresight he cultivated. Where others relied on aggression, he relied on observation; where others acted recklessly, he acted with precision; where others sought notoriety, he sought influence that could endure. The Castellamarese War, with its brutal lessons and shifting alliances, was the crucible in which these qualities were tempered. By the time the city's underworld began to stabilize, Carlo was positioned to rise, not through spectacle, but through quiet mastery, emerging as a man who would eventually command respect, loyalty, and fear, not by shouting, but by speaking softly and observing astutely. The streets of Brooklyn, once noisy and chaotic, had prepared him for a lifetime of control exercised in the shadows, a testament to the power of patience, discretion, and calculated strategy. In the years following the tumult of the Castellamarese War, the underworld of New York began to settle into a new structure, a more organized and deliberate network where power was exercised with strategy rather than chaos. For Carlo Gambino, this period was a time of observation, refinement, and quiet advancement. He had survived the turbulence of violent rivalries, witnessed the consequences of impulsive ambition, and now, with the landscape stabilizing, he was ready to rise. Yet his ascent was not marked by grand gestures, bold proclamations, or dramatic displays of force. Instead, it was a methodical, calculated climb, one measured in subtle alliances, strategic positioning, and careful cultivation of reputation. To understand his rise is to understand the art of subtlety, the power of observation, and the mastery of influence that defined every action he took. Imagine the world in which he moved: dimly lit offices tucked away above bustling shops, smoky restaurants where influential figures gathered over quiet meals, and neighborhoods where loyalty and reputation were the invisible currency of survival. In these spaces, Carlo Gambino operated with the precision of a master strategist. He observed the behavior of allies and rivals alike, noting patterns, tendencies, and opportunities. Every conversation, every exchange, every minor decision was an opportunity to gather intelligence, to assess the character of those around him, and to position himself advantageously. Unlike many who sought attention through boldness or aggression, Carlo understood that influence could be accumulated quietly, invisibly, and that patience could yield far greater power than impulsiveness ever could. During this period, Carlo began to assume responsibilities that would demonstrate his aptitude for leadership without drawing undue attention. He managed operations with discretion, handled disputes with tact, and mediated conflicts between various factions with subtle authority. These actions were not publicized or sensationalized, they were effective because they were quiet, precise, and reliable. The respect he earned was earned silently, built on consistency, competence, and the understanding that loyalty and trust were more valuable than fear or spectacle. As he maneuvered through the complex networks of organized crime, his reputation grew steadily, and those around him began to recognize that he was a man whose decisions carried weight, even when unspoken. The ability to navigate these networks required more than intelligence, it demanded emotional acuity. Carlo Gambino had an exceptional capacity to read people, to discern motivations, fears, and ambitions, and to act in ways that maximized advantage while minimizing risk. He recognized that the appearance of calmness, discretion, and neutrality could be as powerful as direct intervention. By maintaining composure in tense situations, he was able to gain the confidence of both allies and rivals, positioning himself as a mediator and strategist whose counsel could shape outcomes without the need for overt force. It was this combination of strategic insight and emotional intelligence that distinguished him from his peers, allowing him to ascend the ranks quietly but effectively. Alliances were central to Carlo's rise. He understood that relationships were the lifeblood of influence and that loyalty, once earned, could be leveraged to achieve broader objectives. He formed connections with key figures in various families, not through coercion or intimidation, but through careful demonstration of reliability, discretion, and insight. These alliances were cultivated patiently, often over years, and Carlo was adept at maintaining them even in the face of shifting power dynamics. He recognized that each connection, each gesture of trust, had long-term implications, and he navigated these networks with the skill of a chess master, always several moves ahead of those around him. While he advanced within the ranks, Carlo remained acutely aware of the risks inherent in leadership. The mafia, even in its more structured post-war phase, was a dangerous world where missteps could be fatal. He understood that ambition, if not tempered by caution, could lead to disaster, and that visibility often attracted unwanted attention from law enforcement or rival factions. His approach was therefore characterized by a balance of assertiveness and restraint. He acted decisively when necessary, yet always with consideration of timing, consequence, and perception. In doing so, he cultivated an image of reliability, intelligence, and discretion, a man who could be trusted to manage operations effectively without drawing unnecessary scrutiny. Carlo's rise was also facilitated by his keen understanding of human nature. He recognized that power was not merely about control over resources or territory, it was about perception, respect, and the ability to influence behavior subtly. He knew that individuals responded to confidence, consistency, and the quiet assertion of authority. By embodying these qualities, he was able to gain the loyalty of subordinates, the respect of peers, and the cautious admiration of rivals. His influence grew not because he demanded it, but because he demonstrated through action that he could navigate complexity, resolve disputes, and achieve results without creating unnecessary conflict. In this way, he became a central figure whose guidance and judgment were sought even by those who did not owe him direct allegiance. The early 1940s brought further consolidation of Carlo's influence. As older leaders passed from the scene, whether through death, imprisonment, or retirement, Carlo was strategically positioned to assume greater responsibilities. His reputation as a man of discretion, patience, and competence made him an ideal candidate for leadership roles, yet he advanced quietly, never seeking public recognition or dramatic displays of authority. In the world of organized crime, where appearances often masked danger, Carlo's subtlety became his greatest asset. He could achieve objectives. Carlo Gambino's rise through the ranks was not marked by spectacle, but by a series of carefully executed, almost imperceptible moves. He managed operations with discretion, built relationships with insight, and navigated challenges with foresight. He understood the importance of timing, the necessity of patience, and the enduring power of reputation. By the time he emerged as a key figure within the mafia hierarchy, he had already demonstrated the qualities that would later make him one of the most powerful men in organized crime: strategic intelligence, emotional acuity, patience, discretion, and the subtle ability to influence outcomes without overt displays of force. His ascent was a testament to the power of quiet mastery, a reminder that in a world defined by ambition and danger, the most effective leaders are often those who operate in the shadows, observing, calculating, and acting with precision. By the end of this period, Carlo had positioned himself as an indispensable figure within the networks of organized crime. He was respected, trusted, and quietly influential, yet he remained largely invisible to those outside the inner circles. This invisibility was not a weakness but a deliberate strategy, allowing him to operate without attracting unwanted attention, while ensuring that his decisions shaped the operations, alliances, and trajectories of the families around him. His rise through the ranks was a careful orchestration, a series of subtle maneuvers that demonstrated the art of influence, the value of patience, and the enduring power of discretion. In the shadows of Brooklyn and Manhattan, Carlo Gambino had become a master of subtlety, a strategist whose presence would soon be felt across the entire underworld of New York City. By the late 1940s, Carlo Gambino had evolved from a careful observer into a man whose influence quietly shaped the course of organized crime in New York. He had learned the subtle art of leadership not through overt displays of power or loud pronouncements but through quiet mediation, strategic negotiation, and the cultivation of relationships that extended far beyond the immediate demands of business. Imagine the dimly lit rooms where these dealings took place, smoke curling in the air from a half-burned cigar, shadows cast by flickering lamps, and the muted murmur of voices engaged in delicate negotiation. It was a world where a single word, a pause in conversation, or a subtle gesture could alter the course of alliances and reshape the balance of power, and Carlo had become a master at reading and influencing these interactions. As a broker, Carlo understood that power was rarely absolute and that even the most seemingly dominant figures required allies to maintain their positions. He mediated disputes between rival factions with a calm and deliberate approach, listening carefully to grievances, assessing the intentions of each party, and proposing resolutions that minimized conflict while preserving respect and loyalty. Unlike those who relied on intimidation or violence to enforce compliance, Carlo employed patience and intelligence, creating outcomes that appeared natural, even inevitable. This ability to resolve disputes quietly, without spectacle, elevated his reputation as a figure who could be trusted to handle sensitive situations with discretion and skill. The neighborhoods of Brooklyn and Manhattan were rife with tension during this period. Gambling operations, labor rackets, and smuggling enterprises competed for dominance, and rivalries often threatened to erupt into violence. Carlo's presence as a mediator provided a stabilizing influence. His interventions were never flashy, they were deliberate and measured, designed to diffuse potential conflicts before they escalated. He understood that in a world of constant uncertainty, maintaining stability was as important as expanding influence, and that a reputation for fairness and reliability could be more powerful than any act of aggression. Those who worked with him learned that Carlo's calm demeanor concealed a mind always calculating the long-term consequences of every action. Part of Carlo's effectiveness as a broker stemmed from his ability to understand the personalities and motivations of those involved in disputes. He could discern who was driven by ambition, who was motivated by fear, and who could be persuaded through respect and reason. This psychological insight allowed him to tailor his approach to each situation, ensuring that resolutions were accepted without resistance. Carlo's skill was not in coercion but in subtle manipulation, creating an environment where individuals believed that the outcomes he proposed were in their own best interests. Over time, this approach not only resolved immediate conflicts but also strengthened his influence across multiple factions, weaving a web of loyalty and respect that extended far beyond any single interaction. While mediating disputes, Carlo also used the opportunity to expand his network of influence. Each negotiation, each successful resolution, created new avenues of trust and alliance. Figures who might once have viewed him as an outsider came to recognize the value of his counsel and the steadiness of his judgment. He built relationships with men who would later become key players in the organization, cultivating loyalty through consistent demonstration of intelligence, reliability, and discretion. These connections were not forged overnight, they were the result of years of careful observation, patient engagement, and the consistent application of his principles. By the time he had fully established himself as a broker, Carlo had created a foundation of relationships that would serve as the backbone of his empire. The essence of Carlo's approach lay in subtlety. He understood that overt displays of power often provoked resistance or fear, while quiet influence encouraged cooperation and long-term loyalty. He would meet parties in private rooms, sometimes over a simple meal, listening more than he spoke, asking questions that revealed motivations, and offering solutions that appeared equitable to all involved. In these quiet exchanges, he demonstrated the power of patience, observation, and strategic insight. His reputation as a man who could resolve disputes without resorting to violence or coercion became a defining feature of his character, enhancing his authority and reinforcing the perception that he was a stabilizing force in a turbulent world. As Carlo expanded his influence, he also became increasingly adept at understanding the broader strategic landscape. He recognized that alliances and disputes were not isolated events but interconnected threads in the larger fabric of organized crime. A decision made in one neighborhood could ripple through the city, affecting operations, loyalties, and rivalries elsewhere. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Carlo Gambino had moved far beyond the modest streets of his Brooklyn youth, and his influence within the Italian-American underworld was quietly expanding. One of the defining elements of this expansion was his mastery of alliances and the cultivation of loyalty, a combination that allowed him to weave an intricate network of trust and obligation that extended across multiple families and neighborhoods. Unlike those who relied on intimidation or brute force to enforce obedience, Carlo recognized that true power was rooted in relationships, carefully nurtured, strategically maintained, and anchored in respect. His approach was subtle, patient, and highly effective, and it became a cornerstone of the empire he was building. Imagine the world in which Carlo operated: smoke-filled rooms where the air was thick with the scent of cigars, low murmurs of conversation punctuated by laughter or tension, and men of influence seated around tables discussing alliances, disputes, and business. In these settings, Carlo's approach was deliberate. He listened more than he spoke, observing the dynamics between individuals, noting who held influence, who could be swayed, and who might pose a threat. Every interaction was an opportunity to gather intelligence, assess character, and subtly reinforce his position. Over time, his reputation as a calm, judicious, and reliable figure spread, drawing both respect and cautious admiration from allies and rivals alike. Alliances were rarely casual or accidental in Carlo's world. Each one was carefully considered for its potential value and durability. He aligned himself with men whose goals, temperament, and reliability complemented his own, and he was quick to identify those whose ambition or volatility could destabilize a partnership. Loyalty, for Carlo, was both a strategic asset and a moral imperative. He understood that the success of his operations, and ultimately the safety and cohesion of his network, depended on trust that was carefully cultivated and rigorously maintained. A single act of betrayal could unravel months or years of careful planning, so every alliance required attention, assessment, and reinforcement. Carlo's ability to maintain loyalty was grounded in consistency and reliability. Those who worked with him knew that promises would be kept, decisions would be fair, and discretion was paramount. He rarely raised his voice or displayed overt aggression, yet his quiet authority inspired confidence and respect. Subordinates and peers alike recognized that Carlo was a man of his word, a rare trait in a world where duplicity and treachery were common. By consistently demonstrating fairness, discretion, and intelligence, he ensured that loyalty was not forced, but freely given, creating bonds that were resilient and enduring. These relationships became the backbone of his influence, providing both protection and opportunity as he navigated the increasingly complex networks of organized crime. Within these alliances, Carlo also understood the importance of perception. He knew that power was as much about how one was viewed as it was about actual control. By cultivating an image of calm, rational authority, he was able to inspire loyalty without provoking unnecessary fear or resentment. His interactions were measured, his decisions carefully weighed, and his actions deliberate. He avoided the impulsive displays of force that characterized many of his contemporaries, recognizing that subtle influence often produced more lasting results than intimidation. In doing so, he not only secured loyalty but also positioned himself as a mediator, advisor, and stabilizing force within the network. As Carlo's network grew, he also demonstrated remarkable skill in managing the delicate balance of competing interests. Rival factions, differing ambitions, and personal rivalries created a landscape of constant tension, yet Carlo was able to navigate it with skill and precision. He acted as a bridge between conflicting parties, negotiating compromises that preserved relationships while advancing his strategic objectives. In these moments, he demonstrated both tactical intelligence and emotional acuity, understanding not only the mechanics of agreements but also the psychological undercurrents that shaped behavior. This ability to harmonize competing interests without resorting to conflict enhanced his reputation as a man whose counsel was sought and whose judgment was trusted. Carlo's alliances were not limited to those with direct operational roles. He also cultivated relationships with influential figures across the broader Italian-American community. Business owners, political figures, and community leaders became part of his extended network, often unaware of the full extent of his influence. These relationships provided additional layers of protection and opportunity, allowing him to navigate both legitimate and illicit enterprises with remarkable discretion. Carlo's understanding of social dynamics, reputation, and strategic positioning allowed him to integrate these connections seamlessly into his operations, expanding his influence while maintaining the subtlety that defined his approach. Trust, for Carlo, was earned through a combination of reliability, discretion, and shared interest. He understood that loyalty was fragile and that it required continuous reinforcement. Meetings were not merely transactional, they were opportunities to build rapport, demonstrate competence, and solidify confidence. By consistently acting in the best interest of his allies, respecting boundaries, and avoiding unnecessary conflict, Carlo created a culture of loyalty that extended beyond obligation. Those within his network recognized that allegiance to him was both a strategic choice and a reflection of confidence in his judgment and integrity. The ability to manage alliances effectively also required foresight and strategic thinking. Carlo anticipated potential conflicts, identified emerging threats, and positioned himself to mediate disputes before they escalated. He understood that influence was not static, it required active cultivation and attention to evolving dynamics. By maintaining a vigilant awareness of his network, he was able to respond to shifts in power, adjust alliances, and ensure that loyalty remained aligned with his strategic objectives. This foresight allowed him to operate with a level of control that few could match, reinforcing his reputation as a stabilizing and guiding presence. Carlo's mastery of alliances extended to succession planning and the cultivation of protégés. He recognized that loyalty could be strengthened by nurturing the ambitions of others, providing opportunities for growth and influence within the network. By identifying individuals with potential and mentoring them carefully, he ensured that his network remained cohesive, capable, and adaptable. These relationships not only enhanced his operational capacity but also created a sense of shared purpose, reinforcing loyalty through mutual benefit and respect. Carlo's approach to mentorship was consistent with his broader philosophy. Influence was exercised quietly, strategically, and with attention to the long-term implications of each relationship. Over time, Carlo Gambino's careful cultivation of alliances and loyalty transformed him from a skilled operator into a central figure whose influence extended across multiple families and neighborhoods. His reputation for discretion, intelligence, and strategic insight made him a trusted advisor and mediator, and his network became a foundation for stability, coordination, and expansion. Unlike figures who relied on fear or aggression, Carlo relied on trust, respect, and subtle influence, demonstrating that power in the underworld could be accrued and exercised without spectacle. His approach was both effective and enduring, creating a web of relationships that would support his rise to the highest levels of leadership in the years to come. In reflecting on this period of Carlo Gambino's life, it is clear that his understanding of alliances and loyalty was not incidental, it was deliberate, strategic, and central to his philosophy of power. He recognized that influence was rooted in relationships, that trust was a rare and valuable commodity, and that patient, consistent action could achieve far more than impulsive displays of force. By cultivating loyalty carefully, managing alliances thoughtfully, and positioning himself as a stabilizing force, Carlo laid the groundwork for his eventual emergence as one of the most powerful and respected figures in the history of organized crime. In the quiet spaces where deals were made, disputes resolved, and relationships nurtured, Carlo Gambino demonstrated the enduring strength of subtlety, patience, and strategic foresight, creating a network of influence that would define his life and legacy. By 1960, the landscape of organized crime in New York had reached a critical point of transformation. The era of chaotic rivalries and sporadic violence was giving way to a more structured and hierarchical system, one in which decisions were made collectively, and power was distributed among a council rather than concentrated in a single figure. This new system, formalized as the Mafia Commission, represented a radical shift in how families conducted business, resolved disputes, and maintained stability. For Carlo Gambino, this development presented both opportunity and challenge, a chance to consolidate influence without overt confrontation, and a stage upon which his subtle strategic genius could be exercised to its fullest. Imagine the rooms where the commission convened, dimly lit, austere, and hushed except for the low murmur of conversation. The men who gathered there were some of the most powerful figures in organized crime, their reputations forged in years of careful maneuvering, negotiation, and occasional violence. Yet the authority of the commission lay not in displays of aggression, but in the collective recognition of influence and the implicit rules that govern behavior. Each decision carried weight, affecting operations, alliances, and the delicate balance of power across New York and beyond. Carlo Gambino, already a respected figure in the underworld, approached these meetings with calm, measured composure, his quiet presence commanding respect even without ostentation. Carlo's role in the formation and operation of the commission was defined by his deep understanding of strategy, loyalty, and perception. He recognized that the commission was more than a governing body, it was an instrument for shaping long-term stability and influence. Through his participation, he could mediate disputes, coordinate activities across families, and position himself as a central figure in the decision-making hierarchy. His approach was consistent with his broader philosophy: subtlety, observation, and patience were more powerful than force, and influence was most effectively exercised when it appeared natural rather than imposed. In this environment, Carlo's skills were perfectly suited to the demands of leadership. The establishment of the commission also required Carlo to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics. Each member brought their own ambitions, rivalries, and histories, and the success of the group depended on the ability to balance these competing interests. Carlo's reputation for discretion, intelligence, and fairness allowed him to act as a stabilizing presence, building trust among the various factions. He mediated conflicts with a careful understanding of both immediate and long-term consequences, ensuring that resolutions preserved alliances while advancing collective objectives. In doing so, he not only solidified his own influence but also contributed to the broader cohesion and effectiveness of the commission itself. One of Carlo's key contributions to the commission was his mastery of subtle negotiation. Unlike more flamboyant or aggressive figures, he rarely sought attention or immediate recognition. Instead, he listened carefully, assessed the priorities of each party, and proposed solutions that appeared equitable and logical. His interventions were rarely overtly confrontational, rather, they relied on an understanding of psychology, timing, and the delicate balance of perception and reality. Through this method, Carlo was able to achieve outcomes that advanced his strategic goals while reinforcing his reputation as a man whose judgment was sound, measured, and indispensable. Participation in the commission also provided Carlo with unparalleled access to information. He was able to observe the operations, ambitions, and vulnerabilities of other families, gaining insight that could be leveraged to expand influence without provoking direct conflict. This intelligence was invaluable, allowing him to anticipate potential disputes, identify opportunities for alliances, and position himself advantageously within the shifting dynamics of power. Carlo understood that knowledge, combined with patience and discretion, could achieve results far beyond what violence or coercion alone could accomplish. The commission, in essence, became both a platform and a lens through which he could orchestrate influence across the entire New York underworld. Carlo's approach to the commission was also characterized by restraint and strategic foresight. He understood that visibility carried risk, and that overt ambition could provoke envy, resistance, or retaliation. Instead, he cultivated an image of quiet competence, demonstrating reliability, intelligence, and fairness while avoiding unnecessary confrontation. This subtlety enhanced his influence, as others came to rely on his judgment and perspective without perceiving any threat to their own standing. Carlo's presence was felt not through loud assertion but through the careful shaping of outcomes, the orchestration of consensus, and the cultivation of trust and loyalty among those who held power. The Commission's decisions often had far-reaching consequences, affecting not only day-to-day operations but also long-term strategic positioning within the criminal ecosystem. Carlo's ability to anticipate these ripple effects set him apart. He considered not only the immediate outcomes of a resolution but also the future implications for alliances, rivalries, and organizational stability. His interventions were designed to maximize benefit while minimizing risk, ensuring that the families under his influence remained cohesive, disciplined, and aligned with broader objectives. In this way, Carlo's role in the Commission was not merely administrative, it was profoundly strategic, shaping the very architecture of organized crime in New York. Beyond the formal meetings, Carlo also engaged in informal diplomacy. He built relationships, reinforced alliances, and tested loyalties through quiet interactions outside the Commission's sessions. These private exchanges allowed him to gauge character, anticipate challenges, and subtly influence perceptions and decisions. By integrating these informal strategies with his formal role in the Commission, Carlo created a network of influence that extended beyond the official structure, giving him the ability to shape outcomes across multiple layers of the organization. His foresight, discretion, and psychological insight allowed him to operate with remarkable effectiveness, reinforcing the notion that the most enduring power is often exercised quietly. Carlo's strategic positioning within the Commission also prepared him for the eventual consolidation of authority that would define the next phase of his career. He understood that leadership was not simply about occupying a prominent seat but about cultivating influence, managing relationships, and exercising judgment that earned trust and respect. Through his careful orchestration of alliances, his subtle mediation of conflicts, and his thoughtful anticipation of consequences, he positioned himself as a central figure whose guidance was sought and whose decisions carried weight. By the time the landscape stabilized and opportunities for advancement arose, Carlo was uniquely prepared to assume a level of authority that few could challenge. Participation in the Commission also reinforced Carlo's broader philosophy of leadership. Influence is most effective when it is earned quietly, exercised judiciously, and maintained through trust and respect. He demonstrated that patience, discretion, and strategic foresight could achieve results far beyond what violence or coercion could accomplish. His rise within the Commission exemplified the principles he had cultivated throughout his life: careful observation, understanding human nature, cultivating loyalty, and acting with precision at the right moment. These principles, applied consistently and subtly, allowed him to consolidate power in ways that were enduring, sustainable, and almost invisible to outsiders. By the end of this period, Carlo Gambino had firmly established himself as a man whose influence within the mafia was both pervasive and respected. His role in the 1960 Mafia Commission was a testament to his strategic intelligence, subtlety, and foresight. He had learned to navigate complex interpersonal dynamics, mediate disputes effectively, and position himself advantageously across multiple families. More than that, he had demonstrated that leadership need not rely on spectacle or aggression. It could be exercised quietly, strategically, and with careful attention to relationships and perception. In the quiet rooms of the Commission, Carlo Gambino was not merely a participant, he was a shaper of power, a master of influence, and a man whose presence would resonate throughout the underworld for decades to come. The night of Carlo Gambino's ascension to the pinnacle of power was not marked by fanfare, sirens, or public spectacle. Unlike the dramatic rises of some of his contemporaries, his assumption of leadership was subtle, deliberate, and almost imperceptible to the wider world. The circumstances that led to his rise were rooted in both strategy and opportunity, a combination of long-term planning, patience, and the quiet orchestration of alliances that had been cultivated over decades. The death of Albert Anastasia in 1957, gunned down in a hotel barber shop under the cover of an ordinary day, created a vacuum in the underworld, an opening that Carlo was uniquely positioned to fill. While others may have sought to seize control through aggression or intimidation, Carlo's method was the product of years of careful observation, strategic foresight, and the cultivation of trust and loyalty across the intricate networks of organized crime. Imagine the streets of Manhattan and Brooklyn in the aftermath of Anastasia's death, the air thick with rumor, uncertainty, and the quiet apprehension of those whose fortunes and lives depended on stability within the criminal world. Carlo's rise was not announced, yet it was immediately recognized by those in the inner circle. Key figures in the underworld understood that he possessed the rare combination of strategic intelligence, discretion, and respect that could maintain order and continuity without provoking unnecessary conflict. His quiet reputation had preceded him, and now, in the moment of opportunity, it allowed him to step into the role of boss with minimal resistance and maximal legitimacy. This was a triumph of subtlety, patience, and strategic positioning, a hallmark of Carlo's approach to power. The process of consolidating authority was itself a careful exercise in diplomacy and influence. Carlo Gambino understood that leadership was as much about perception and relationships as it was about control. He moved swiftly to secure the loyalty of key lieutenants, allies, and influential figures, reinforcing bonds of trust while subtly neutralizing potential threats. Meetings were conducted with discretion, decisions communicated quietly, and disputes resolved before they could escalate into public conflict. By acting with both decisiveness and tact, Carlo ensured that his rise was viewed as legitimate, orderly, and stabilizing, rather than opportunistic or aggressive. This approach not only secured his position but also set the tone for the style of leadership he would maintain throughout his tenure. Carlo's strategy for consolidating power was rooted in his deep understanding of human nature. He knew that fear could enforce obedience temporarily, but respect and loyalty produced enduring influence. By demonstrating fairness, intelligence, and reliability, he cultivated allegiance not through coercion but through confidence in his judgment and leadership. Those within his network quickly recognized that Carlo's decisions were guided by strategic foresight rather than impulse, and that alignment with him was both advantageous and secure. This subtle cultivation of loyalty ensured that challenges to his authority were minimal, and that his influence extended far beyond those who were directly subordinate to him. One of the key aspects of Carlo's ascension was his ability to maintain discretion while exercising power. Unlike other figures who sought public notoriety or flaunted their dominance, Carlo operated quietly, allowing his influence to be felt rather than broadcast. Meetings were private, negotiations conducted behind closed doors, and operational decisions executed with minimal exposure. This discretion not only protected him from law enforcement scrutiny but also reinforced his reputation as a stabilizing and reliable figure. In a world where impulsive action often led to violent retribution or legal entanglement, Carlo's ability to act subtly yet effectively was a critical factor in the durability of his power. Carlo's leadership style also emphasized the importance of strategic alliances and the careful management of relationships. He recognized that power was distributed across networks, and that the ability to influence outcomes depended on understanding and leveraging these networks effectively. By maintaining strong ties with key figures across multiple families, he ensured that his authority was reinforced through collaboration and mutual interest rather than conflict. This approach allowed him to manage disputes, coordinate operations, and consolidate control with remarkable efficiency. His rise was not a solitary achievement, it was the product of careful relationship building and the strategic integration of loyalty, trust, and influence. The quiet nature of Carlo's ascension also had a stabilizing effect on the underworld. In the wake of Anastasia's death, the potential for violence, rivalry, and chaos was high. Yet Carlo's methodical, patient, and discreet approach diffused tensions and provided a sense of continuity and order. Allies and rivals alike recognized that his leadership would be predictable, measured, and strategically sound. This perception not only minimized conflict but also enhanced his reputation as a wise and capable leader, someone whose judgment could be relied upon even in times of uncertainty. In essence, his rise exemplified the power of subtle influence over spectacle, of strategic foresight over impulsive aggression. Carlo's strategic approach also extended to operational control. He maintained oversight of key rackets, ensuring that revenue streams were managed efficiently and disputes resolved discreetly. At the same time, he delegated responsibility to trusted lieutenants, allowing them autonomy while retaining ultimate authority. This balance between central control and distributed responsibility was a hallmark of his leadership, ensuring both operational efficiency and organizational cohesion. By empowering capable subordinates while maintaining strategic oversight, Carlo strengthened his network, reinforced loyalty, and positioned himself as a leader whose authority was both respected and effective. The long-term consequences of Carlo's ascension were profound. He established a model of leadership that prioritized subtlety, discretion, and strategic intelligence over the brash displays of power that had characterized earlier eras. His influence extended not only through direct control of operations but also through the networks of trust, loyalty, and respect he had cultivated. By consolidating authority quietly and effectively, he created an environment in which stability and efficiency were prioritized, and in which the potential for destructive conflict was minimized. This approach allowed him to maintain control over a vast and complex organization for decades, a testament to the power of patient strategy and careful planning. In reflecting on Carlo Gambino's rise to boss, it is clear that his success was the result of decades of preparation, observation, and calculated action. He had learned the lessons of his youth in Palermo, the streets of Brooklyn, and the turbulent conflicts of the Castellamarese War. Patience, discretion, observation, and strategic calculation were more powerful than violence, fear, or ostentation. By applying these principles consistently, he was able to ascend to leadership in a moment of opportunity, consolidate power without conflict, and establish a model of influence that would endure. His rise was not marked by spectacle or force, but by subtlety, intelligence, and the careful orchestration of relationships, alliances, and perception. By the time Carlo Gambino had firmly assumed the role of boss, he had transformed from a quiet observer into a man whose influence shaped the entire landscape of organized crime in New York. His leadership was defined by discretion, strategic foresight, and an understanding of human nature that allowed him to navigate complex networks of loyalty, ambition, and rivalry with skill and precision. In the shadowed corners of the city, his presence was felt in the decisions, alliances, and operations that continued to unfold, a testament to the enduring power of subtlety, patience, and strategic mastery. Carlo Gambino's rise was a quiet triumph, a demonstration that true authority is often exercised not through noise, but through observation, calculation, and the careful cultivation of trust and loyalty. At the height of his power, Carlo Gambino's empire stretched across the city like an invisible web, each strand connecting people, operations, and neighborhoods in a delicate but unbreakable network. His influence was pervasive, yet almost imperceptible to those who did not move within the inner circles of organized crime. Unlike the flamboyant displays of authority that characterized some of his contemporaries, Carlo exercised control with quiet precision. The streets of Brooklyn, Manhattan, and beyond felt his presence not through dramatic acts, but through the subtle orchestration of decisions, alliances, and expectations. Every operation under his domain, from gambling and loan sharking to labor rackets and union control, was managed with an attention to detail that reflected his patient, strategic mind. Imagine the offices where these decisions were made, dimly lit, filled with the faint haze of cigar smoke, the quiet rustle of papers, and the measured voices of trusted lieutenants discussing business. Carlo's presence in these spaces was calm, deliberate, and commanding, even without overt gestures. He spoke softly, choosing his words with care, letting silence carry as much weight as speech. Those who worked alongside him learned quickly that a single comment or suggestion from Gambino could redirect operations, influence negotiations, or shift alliances. This subtlety was not merely a personal trait but a deliberate strategy, ensuring that his power remained unchallenged while minimizing the risks associated with visibility in both the criminal world and the eyes of law enforcement. Carlo's empire was not centralized in the way a corporate organization might be, it was decentralized, flexible, and resilient. He relied on trusted lieutenants to manage day-to-day operations, allowing them autonomy while maintaining ultimate authority. This balance of delegation and oversight was key to the longevity of his control. Subordinates were empowered, yet they knew that decisions ultimately rested with Carlo. His ability to inspire loyalty, maintain discipline, and enforce expectations quietly ensured operational efficiency without the need for public intimidation. In many ways, his management style resembled that of a careful strategist. He set the rules, provided guidance, and intervened only when necessary, allowing the system to function smoothly while he maintained oversight. The scope of Gambino's influence extended beyond the criminal activities themselves. He was deeply attuned to the social and cultural dynamics of the communities in which he operated. He understood that public perception, reputation, and relationships were as critical to sustaining power as control over revenue streams or territory. By maintaining a careful balance between visibility and discretion, he ensured that his organization was both respected and feared, without provoking unnecessary attention or resistance. Carlo's presence in the community was subtle but felt, a testament to his understanding that true authority lies as much in perception as it does in action. Daily life within Gambino's empire was a study in contrasts. On the one hand, operations were highly structured and meticulously managed, on the other, the streets and neighborhoods in which they operated were dynamic and unpredictable. Carlo's approach to this environment reflected his lifelong philosophy: observe first, act second, and always consider the consequences of any action. He cultivated a network of informants, trusted associates, and allies who kept him informed of shifts in power, potential conflicts, and opportunities for expansion. This intelligence allowed him to respond proactively, often preventing disputes before they escalated and positioning his organization advantageously in negotiations, territory management, and alliances. Carlo's attention to human behavior was central to his control. He understood the motivations, fears, and ambitions of those around him, from his lieutenants to his rivals, and he used this understanding to guide decisions, mediate disputes, and influence outcomes. His meetings were not merely transactional, they were psychological exercises in persuasion, observation, and strategy. By reading subtle cues, the tone of voice, the choice of words, the hesitation in a gesture, Carlo could discern loyalties, intentions, and vulnerabilities. This mastery of human perception allowed him to maintain authority without resorting to overt coercion, ensuring that his influence was both profound and enduring. Despite the complexity of his operations, Carlo Gambino maintained a calm, measured demeanor in all dealings. He avoided rash decisions, impulsive actions, and unnecessary displays of aggression. Where others relied on intimidation, violence, or spectacle to assert control, Gambino relied on subtlety, intelligence, and foresight. His reputation for fairness, discretion, and strategic insight earned him respect across the network, reinforcing loyalty and stabilizing the organization. Associates knew that he could be trusted to handle delicate situations with care, that his judgment was sound, and that aligning with him was both prudent and advantageous. Gambino's control extended to the management of conflict within the organization. Disputes, rivalries, and misunderstandings were inevitable in such a vast network, yet Carlo's approach was methodical. He mediated disagreements quietly, assessed the motivations of the parties involved, and proposed solutions that balanced fairness with strategic advantage. His interventions were rarely forceful, instead, they relied on logic, persuasion, and the subtle reinforcement of loyalty. By addressing conflicts proactively, he maintained cohesion within the organization, reduced the risk of open confrontation, and strengthened his authority as a stabilizing force. This skillful management of internal dynamics was a key factor in the durability of his empire. Carlo also understood the importance of long-term planning and foresight. He anticipated changes in the criminal and economic landscape, identified emerging opportunities, and positioned his organization to take advantage of shifts in influence, law enforcement focus, and market dynamics. His decisions were guided by a careful analysis of risk and reward, ensuring that each action contributed to the sustainability and growth of the enterprise. By combining strategic vision with operational discipline, Carlo was able to maintain control over an extensive network without overextending himself or exposing vulnerabilities. His approach demonstrated that true power lies in balance, the ability to manage both immediate operations and long-term objectives with equal skill. The psychological dimension of Gambino's leadership cannot be overstated. He was keenly aware of how perception shaped behavior, and he used this knowledge to reinforce authority and loyalty. Associates were motivated not only by fear but by respect, trust, and a belief in his judgment. Carlo's quiet confidence, measured demeanor, and reputation for discretion created an environment in which decisions were accepted, directives followed, and conflicts avoided. He understood that leadership is as much about shaping perception as it is about issuing commands, and he applied this principle consistently across every layer of his organization. Even as he maintained extensive operations, Carlo Gambino remained a master of invisibility. He avoided public attention, media exposure, and law enforcement scrutiny, allowing his organization to function efficiently while minimizing risk. This low-profile approach reinforced the perception that he was everywhere and nowhere at once. His influence was felt in the outcomes of negotiations, the resolution of disputes, and the smooth operation of enterprises, yet he was rarely directly visible. By maintaining this balance between presence and discretion, Carlo ensured the durability of his authority, protecting both himself and his network from unnecessary scrutiny or conflict. In reflecting on the daily life of Carlo Gambino at the height of his power, it is clear that his control was both pervasive and subtle, efficient and discreet. He managed a complex network of operations, alliances, and relationships with a combination of observation, intelligence, and strategic foresight. His leadership style emphasized discretion, patience, and respect, reinforcing loyalty while minimizing conflict. Through careful orchestration of people, operations, and perception, Carlo Gambino created an empire that was resilient, adaptable, and enduring, a testament to the power of quiet mastery over spectacle, subtlety over aggression, and strategy over impulse. By the mid-1960s, Carlo Gambino's empire had become a model of disciplined, intelligent control. It was an organization that could withstand challenges, adapt to changing circumstances, and maintain loyalty across multiple families and neighborhoods. His influence was both extensive and profound, yet almost invisible to the casual observer. The streets, offices, and backrooms of New York City carried the weight of his authority not through violence or fear, but through the careful orchestration of trust, observation, and strategic decision-making. In the quiet, deliberate rhythm of his leadership, Carlo Gambino exemplified the art of empire building in silence, a master of control whose power was felt far more than it was seen. Even at the height of his power, Carlo Gambino understood that influence and authority were never static. They required constant vigilance, strategic foresight, and the ability to navigate an environment filled with both overt and hidden threats. Rival families, ambitious lieutenants, and the ever-present scrutiny of law enforcement created a landscape in which one misstep could unravel decades of careful planning. Unlike many figures who relied on fear or intimidation to assert dominance, Carlo's approach to handling rivals was subtle, methodical, and precise. He understood that power was most enduring when it was exercised quietly, when threats were neutralized with intelligence rather than brute force, and when the perception of authority was as carefully maintained as its actual execution. Picture the dimly lit rooms where these matters were addressed, smoke curling lazily from cigars, soft murmurs of conversation punctuated by the occasional measured pause, the weight of anticipation hanging in the air. Carlo did not dominate the space with loud declarations or threats. Instead, he listened intently, observing not only what was said, but what was implied, what was left unsaid, and what the subtleties of gesture and tone revealed about intentions and loyalties. In these moments, he assessed character, calculated risk, and determined the most effective course of action. His ability to remain calm and deliberate in tense situations became a hallmark of his leadership, reinforcing his reputation as a man whose judgment could be relied upon even in the most volatile circumstances. When dealing with rivals, Carlo Gambino often employed strategies of persuasion, negotiation, and subtle pressure rather than direct confrontation. He understood that forcing compliance through aggression could provoke resistance, resentment, or even violent retaliation. Instead, he created environments in which cooperation seemed beneficial to all parties, where aligning with him appeared to be the rational choice. By offering opportunities for collaboration, mediating disputes, and occasionally leveraging discreet threats, he maintained authority without inciting open conflict. This approach required a profound understanding of human behavior, an ability to read motives and predict reactions, and a patience that allowed outcomes to unfold according to plan rather than impulse. Carlo also recognized the importance of timing when dealing with threats. Immediate reactions could escalate tensions unnecessarily, while delayed action could allow rival ambitions to solidify. He learned to wait for the precise moment to intervene, to act when it would yield maximum advantage with minimal risk. This strategic patience was evident in how he managed conflicts within his own organization as well as in interactions with competing families. By observing carefully, assessing loyalties, and anticipating reactions, Carlo ensured that potential threats were neutralized effectively while maintaining the stability and cohesion of his empire. Rival families posed a particular challenge, as their ambitions and actions could affect not only Carlo's immediate operations but also the broader balance of power in New York's organized crime network. Carlo approached these relationships with a combination of diplomacy and subtle assertion of authority. He maintained open lines of communication, cultivated mutual interests, and leveraged his reputation for fairness and discretion to foster cooperation. At the same time, he remained vigilant, always aware of potential duplicity or hidden agendas. His ability to navigate these complex dynamics allowed him to manage rivalries with minimal disruption, reinforcing his influence while avoiding unnecessary confrontation. Internal threats required an equally nuanced approach. Ambitious lieutenants or associates who questioned authority could destabilize operations or undermine loyalty within the organization. Carlo managed these situations with a combination of mentorship, persuasion, and strategic positioning. He identified the motivations of each individual, addressed grievances before they escalated, and reinforced the benefits of loyalty and alignment with his vision. By demonstrating both intelligence and fairness, he maintained control without resorting to punitive measures unnecessarily, ensuring that dissent was managed constructively and that the integrity of his organization remained intact. Carlo's understanding of risk extended to law enforcement and external pressures. He was keenly aware that visibility, whether through operational missteps or overt displays of authority, could attract scrutiny and jeopardize both his freedom and the security of his empire. As a result, he emphasized discretion in all dealings, ensuring that operations were conducted with minimal exposure and that potential threats were managed quietly. By combining operational caution with strategic foresight, Carlo created an environment in which rivals, subordinates, and law enforcement alike were constrained by his influence without the need for overt coercion or violence. A critical element of his approach to handling rivals was the cultivation of loyalty and trust. Carlo understood that those who felt secure, respected, and valued were less likely to challenge authority or act against the organization's interests. He invested time in building relationships, mentoring key figures, and reinforcing confidence in his leadership. This proactive approach reduced the likelihood of rebellion or betrayal, allowing him to manage threats indirectly while maintaining organizational cohesion. Loyalty, in Carlo's view, was not demanded through fear but earned through consistent judgment, discretion, and the perception of fairness. Carlo's management of rivals also relied on careful observation of patterns and behavior. He could detect subtle signs of ambition, dissatisfaction, or duplicity before they became problematic. By interpreting gestures, tones, and actions, he anticipated potential conflicts and intervened before they escalated. This anticipatory strategy allowed him to maintain stability while minimizing the need for direct confrontation. In essence, Carlo's handling of rivals was a blend of psychological insight, strategic patience, and disciplined execution, demonstrating that power could be exerted effectively without violence or spectacle. Even when confrontation became necessary, Carlo's use of force was strategic and measured. He understood that violence, while sometimes unavoidable, carried risks that could destabilize relationships and attract unwanted attention. Therefore, any action taken against a rival or internal threat was carefully planned, targeted, and discreet. The goal was to neutralize the danger without creating unnecessary collateral consequences, maintaining both authority and organizational integrity. In this way, Carlo reinforced the perception that he was in control, that challenges would be addressed decisively, and that his judgment was both reliable and respected. Carlo's approach to managing rivals also extended to long-term strategic positioning. He understood that relationships, influence, and power were dynamic, and that maintaining authority required continuous adjustment and foresight. By cultivating loyalty, anticipating threats, and acting strategically, he ensured that his position remained secure while expanding his influence across the underworld. This proactive, subtle approach distinguished him from contemporaries who relied on immediate aggression or intimidation, allowing Carlo to maintain dominance quietly yet effectively. At the same time, Carlo balanced authority with restraint. He avoided unnecessary displays of power, preferring to let his reputation and strategic skill speak for themselves. This approach not only protected him from direct threats but also enhanced the respect and loyalty of those around him. By demonstrating composure, intelligence, and measured action, he created an environment in which rivals were deterred not by fear alone, but by recognition of his capability, foresight, and the stability of his organization. In this way, his influence was enduring, his control subtle, and his authority largely unchallenged. In reflecting on Carlo Gambino's approach to rivals and threats, it becomes clear that his genius lay in subtlety, patience, and strategic mastery. He neutralized danger not through overt aggression, but through foresight, observation, diplomacy, and carefully cultivated loyalty. His ability to anticipate, influence, and manage both internal and external threats allowed him to maintain stability while expanding influence. In a world where impulsive action often led to conflict and chaos, Carlo's disciplined, measured approach ensured the durability of his power and the cohesion of his empire. Through quiet mastery, calculated intervention, and strategic foresight, he transformed the management of rivals from a reactive necessity into a deliberate art, solidifying his position as one of the most respected and formidable figures in the history of organized crime. Even as Carlo Gambino's influence grew to encompass much of New York's organized crime network, he remained an enigma to the wider public and to the press. Unlike some of his contemporaries, whose lives were marked by flamboyant displays, loud personalities, or sensational criminal acts that drew headlines, Carlo was almost invisible in the public eye. He moved through the world with a quiet precision, ensuring that his activities, his decisions, and even his presence remained largely unknown outside the inner circles of the underworld. To the media, he was a shadow, a figure whose name might occasionally surface in rumors or whispers, but whose power was almost entirely intangible and unseen. It was this very elusiveness that contributed to the myth surrounding him, elevating his reputation to almost legendary proportions. Imagine the offices of 1960s newspapers, where reporters chased leads, scoured court records, and trawled through police reports, yet consistently came up empty when attempting to pin down the true nature of Carlo Gambino's operations. Investigations would yield names, partial connections, and hints of influence, but never the full picture. The press speculated endlessly, piecing together fragmented stories of wealth, influence, and crime, yet Carlo remained elusive. He had mastered the art of invisibility, ensuring that even those who sought him could never fully grasp his methods, his reach, or his network of alliances. In a world increasingly fascinated by notoriety, he was the antithesis of spectacle, a man whose power was felt far more than it was seen. This elusiveness contributed to the myth of Carlo Gambino. To outsiders, he was almost a phantom, a figure whose authority was absolute yet hidden, a man who orchestrated events from behind closed doors while remaining invisible in public records and media accounts. Stories circulated of his ability to settle disputes, mediate conflicts, and consolidate power without ever raising his voice or appearing in public. These stories, often incomplete and embellished by rumor, created a mystique around him that only enhanced his influence. The combination of secrecy, strategic foresight, and reputation made him a figure both respected and feared, an authority whose presence was sensed even by those who had never met him personally. Carlo's approach to media and public perception was deliberate. He understood that visibility carried risk, both from law enforcement and from rival factions seeking to exploit attention to their advantage. By remaining discreet, he minimized exposure, protecting both himself and his organization from unnecessary scrutiny. He avoided public appearances, declined interviews, and ensured that his movements and activities were largely shielded from the press. This control over his visibility allowed him to dictate the narrative of his influence indirectly, letting rumors and speculation enhance his mystique while maintaining operational security. In essence, he manipulated perception without ever needing to intervene directly, a strategy that reinforced both power and protection. The myths surrounding Carlo also served a strategic purpose within the underworld. Rivals and associates alike were often uncertain about the extent of his influence, the reach of his operations, and the depth of his connections. This uncertainty created an invisible barrier of caution, as those who might have considered challenging him were hesitant to act without a clear understanding of his capabilities. By remaining understated yet strategically influential, Carlo ensured that his authority was both respected and largely uncontested. The legend of the Quiet Dawn became a tool, an extension of his power, reinforcing the stability of his empire without necessitating overt demonstrations of force. At the same time, Carlo's discretion allowed him to maintain alliances and influence across multiple families. Without the distraction of public attention, he could focus on the subtle art of negotiation, mediation, and strategic positioning. Meetings were private, communications discreet, and operations executed with precision. His invisibility did not diminish his authority, it enhanced it, creating an environment in which decisions flowed smoothly, loyalty was cultivated naturally, and rivalries were managed without escalation. Carlo's mastery of perception ensured that he was perceived as omnipresent in influence, yet invisible in practice, a paradox that only heightened his mystique. The stories told about Carlo often exaggerated his power, but they also captured essential truths about his approach. Tales of his ability to settle disputes, influence decisions, and control outcomes without direct action illustrated a reality that was both factual and symbolic. His quiet authority, patience, and strategic foresight allowed him to operate in ways that were invisible to casual observers but unmistakable to those within the network. The myths that grew around him served as a reinforcement of his strategy, shaping perceptions both within the criminal underworld and in the broader public consciousness. In a sense, Carlo became larger than life not because of what he did openly, but because of what he accomplished quietly, leaving observers to fill in the gaps with speculation and awe. This control over narrative extended to interactions with law enforcement as well. Carlo understood that public perception, combined with operational secrecy, could shield him from investigation or disruption. By maintaining a low profile, he reduced the opportunities for authorities to link him directly to criminal activities. Simultaneously, his reputation for intelligence, foresight, and subtle influence meant that law enforcement often treated him with caution, recognizing that his methods were calculated, discreet, and difficult to penetrate. This balance between invisibility and influence allowed him to operate effectively while minimizing the risks inherent in leadership within a criminal network. Carlo's engagement with myths and perception was not passive, it was carefully managed. He allowed stories to circulate, rumors to grow, and speculation to flourish, all while avoiding any direct contradiction or confirmation. This hands-off manipulation of narrative reinforced his mystique, creating a sense of unpredictability that further enhanced his authority. Associates, rivals, and even law enforcement were left to grapple with the idea of a man whose power seemed boundless, whose influence was invisible, and whose judgment was impeccable. This aura of mystery became a central component of his leadership, allowing him to consolidate authority and command respect without overt action. At the same time, Carlo's ability to remain unseen allowed him to focus on strategic operations, alliance building, and long-term planning. Free from the distractions of public attention, he could dedicate himself to managing complex networks, resolving disputes quietly, and orchestrating influence across multiple families and territories. His discretion was not a limitation, it was a tool, enabling him to operate efficiently, protect his organization, and maintain control over an empire that spanned the city. In this way, the very myths that surrounded him became intertwined with his operational success, enhancing both perception and reality. By the mid-1960s, Carlo Gambino's reputation as a man of mystery and influence was firmly established. He had cultivated a persona that combined invisibility, strategic intelligence, and quiet authority. The media, despite relentless speculation, could never fully capture his operations, his reach, or his methods. The myths that circulated only reinforced the perception of a man who could command loyalty, resolve disputes, and exert influence across the criminal world without ever raising his voice. Carlo's ability to manipulate perception while exercising real power exemplified his mastery of subtlety, strategy, and patience, ensuring that his authority remained unchallenged and his legacy secure. In reflecting on Carlo Gambino's interactions with the media and the myths that surrounded him, it becomes clear that his genius lay not only in operational control but also in the orchestration of perception. By remaining invisible, managing reputation, and allowing speculation to flourish, he created an environment in which his influence was respected, feared, and almost untouchable. The legend of the Quiet Dawn became inseparable from the reality of his power, reinforcing his authority and shaping the underworld's perception of what it meant to be a master of organized crime. In this delicate balance between fact and myth, visibility and invisibility, Carlo Gambino demonstrated that true power often lies not in being seen, but in being understood, or feared, without ever appearing at all. While Carlo Gambino's influence over the underworld of New York was vast and far-reaching, he maintained a private life that was largely shielded from the eyes of the public and even many within his own organization. At home, in the quiet spaces of his household, he embraced a world of family, tradition, and domestic routine that contrasted sharply with the tension, intrigue, and constant vigilance of his professional life. Imagine a modest yet comfortable home in Brooklyn, where the scent of home-cooked meals mingled with the faint aroma of cigars and polished wood furniture, where laughter and conversation filled the rooms, and the outside world, with all its dangers and uncertainties, felt distant, almost unreal. Here, Carlo Gambino was not the shadowy don whose decisions shaped criminal empires, he was a father, a husband, and a figure who sought stability and continuity in the private realm of family life. Carlo's approach to family life reflected the values he had absorbed in Palermo and reinforced in Brooklyn during his youth. Loyalty, respect, and discretion were paramount. Within the household, he cultivated an atmosphere of order and security, ensuring that his children and spouse were protected from both the pressures of his professional world and the prying eyes of outsiders. He understood that family was a source of grounding, a space where he could retreat from the constant calculations, negotiations, and subtle power plays that defined his work. This sanctuary allowed him to maintain mental clarity, emotional balance, and strategic focus, ensuring that the pressures of empire building did not consume him entirely. His relationship with his children was marked by quiet guidance and measured attention. Carlo did not indulge in overt displays of affection or permissiveness, but rather emphasized principles, responsibility, and respect. In many ways, he applied the same approach to parenting that he used in leadership, observation, patience, and strategic influence. He encouraged his children to learn from their surroundings, to understand the importance of discretion and judgment, and to navigate their own social and professional environments with intelligence and care. The lessons imparted were subtle but enduring, instilling in them a sense of awareness, resilience, and the value of measured action. Carlo's spouse also played a critical role in the private dimension of his life. She provided not only companionship but also stability, understanding, and discretion. In the home, she helped create a space of calm, ensuring that daily routines and domestic affairs remained orderly and insulated from the complexities of Carlo's professional world. Their relationship was built on mutual respect, shared values, and an understanding of the unique pressures associated with Carlo's position. This partnership allowed him to navigate the demands of leadership with a degree of emotional support that was essential to sustaining his effectiveness in both personal and professional spheres. The contrast between Carlo's domestic serenity and the dangerous, high-stakes world of organized crime was striking. In one realm, he exercised influence quietly, managing disputes, alliances, and operations across a sprawling network. In the other, he enjoyed simple routines, family meals, and moments of reflection. This duality was not a contradiction but a deliberate balance, a conscious effort to maintain equilibrium between the external pressures of leadership and the internal need for stability and emotional grounding. The domestic sphere provided respite, clarity, and perspective, allowing Carlo to recharge and approach his professional responsibilities with renewed focus and precision. Even within his private life, Carlo Gambino maintained an element of discipline and structure. Daily routines, schedules, and predictable habits were observed, creating an environment of order and reliability. This structure reinforced the stability of the household, protected against external intrusion, and reflected the same principles he applied to managing his empire: control, foresight, and strategic organization. By maintaining order in both personal and professional realms, Carlo ensured that his influence remained effective and sustainable, and that his family remained insulated from the chaos that defined the broader world in which he operated. Carlo's approach to privacy extended beyond physical boundaries to matters of communication and secrecy. Discussions about business, alliances, or organizational strategy were carefully kept separate from family life. Children and household members were shielded from the complexities and dangers of the underworld, preserving innocence and protecting them from potential exposure. This conscious separation reflected Carlo's understanding that influence and discretion were not limited to professional operations but were also essential in preserving the security and well-being of those he loved most. The household became a sanctuary of safety and calm, where the outside world's uncertainties could be set aside, if only temporarily. The lessons Carlo imparted to his family were often indirect, conveyed through example rather than explicit instruction. By demonstrating patience, strategic thought, and measured behavior, he taught his children about the value of discretion, foresight, and careful decision-making. They observed a man who could navigate complex and dangerous networks without unnecessary conflict, who exercised authority without spectacle, and who valued loyalty and trust above all. These examples became powerful, internalized lessons, shaping their understanding of human behavior, relationships, and the importance of careful judgment. Carlo's family life also reflected a deep appreciation for cultural heritage and tradition. The rituals, meals, and celebrations of his Sicilian background were preserved and observed, providing continuity and identity amidst a rapidly changing environment. These traditions reinforced familial bonds, instilled a sense of history and belonging, and provided a framework for moral and ethical guidance. Within this context, Carlo's children and spouse experienced both the warmth of family and the subtle lessons of observation, patience, and discretion, learning to navigate their own lives with awareness and care. The domestic sphere also offered Carlo opportunities for reflection and long-term planning. Away from the immediacy of operational decisions and the scrutiny of allies and rivals, he could consider strategic moves, assess risks, and plan future actions. This quiet time allowed him to integrate lessons from past experiences, anticipate emerging threats, and refine his approach to leadership. In many ways, the serenity of home functioned as both a refuge and a strategic laboratory, where insight and foresight were nurtured alongside the bonds of family. Despite the relative calm of his domestic life, Carlo Gambino never lost sight of the broader context in which he operated. Awareness of potential threats, both external and internal, remained a constant undercurrent. Yet within the home, this vigilance was tempered by the need for stability, safety, and emotional grounding. By maintaining this balance, Carlo exemplified the duality of a life lived in two worlds: the public sphere of influence, negotiation, and quiet authority, and the private sphere of family, tradition, and personal reflection. The ability to navigate these dualities with skill, discretion, and patience was central to his enduring success and to the resilience of both his family and his organization. Carlo Gambino's family life also served to humanize the man who, in the eyes of outsiders, was often reduced to a mythic figure of power and mystery. Within the household, he was a father concerned with the growth, safety, and well-being of his children, a husband attentive to partnership and stability, a figure who valued trust, respect, and discretion. This private side of Carlo offered a glimpse into the qualities that underpinned his professional mastery: patience, observation, strategic thinking, and the ability to maintain composure under pressure. It was these same qualities that allowed him to navigate the complexities of the underworld while preserving both influence and personal security. In reflecting on Carlo Gambino's private life, it becomes clear that the domestic sphere was not a separate or incidental aspect of his identity, but an integral part of his approach to life and leadership. The household provided sanctuary, continuity, and guidance, reinforcing the principles that governed his public actions: patience, discretion, strategic thinking, and loyalty. By balancing the demands of empire with the needs of family, Carlo demonstrated an extraordinary ability to integrate multiple dimensions of life, maintaining both authority and humanity, power and perspective. In the quiet, ordered spaces of his home, the man who commanded an empire revealed the values, discipline, and foresight that defined his enduring legacy. By the 1960s and early 1970s, Carlo Gambino's empire had reached a level of sophistication, influence, and stability that few could rival. Yet with prominence came inevitable scrutiny. Law enforcement, increasingly coordinated and technologically sophisticated, had begun to focus attention on the networks that had long operated quietly in the shadows. The FBI, local police, and federal authorities were all developing methods to track, investigate, and dismantle organized crime, employing surveillance, wiretaps, informants, and undercover operations. For many figures in the underworld, this represented a serious and immediate threat. For Carlo, however, the rising pressure of law enforcement became another test of his careful, strategic approach, an opportunity to demonstrate the discipline, foresight, and subtlety that had defined his life. Imagine the offices of federal agencies at the time: cigarette smoke curling in dimly lit rooms, stacks of reports detailing suspected criminal activities, surveillance logs, and photographs meticulously catalogued. Investigators attempted to map connections, understand hierarchies, and anticipate moves within the mafia's complex networks. Yet for all their preparation, the shadow of Carlo Gambino proved elusive. Unlike some of his contemporaries, who engaged in flamboyant acts that drew attention, Carlo maintained a near-perfect balance of visibility and invisibility, ensuring that operational control, alliances, and strategic influence remained intact while minimizing exposure. The very qualities that had propelled him to power, patience, discretion, and meticulous planning, now served as protection against external scrutiny. Carlo's strategies for avoiding law enforcement attention were multi-layered. Operations were compartmentalized, with trusted lieutenants managing day-to-day activities, leaving him insulated from direct involvement. Communications were carefully controlled, meetings conducted discreetly, and financial transactions structured to avoid obvious traces. By maintaining this separation, Carlo ensured that his hands appeared clean, even as he exercised extensive control over his organization. His approach reflected a deep understanding of both human behavior and procedural law enforcement methods, allowing him to anticipate potential vulnerabilities and act preemptively to mitigate risk. Surveillance, both physical and electronic, became an increasing concern during this period. Wiretaps, stakeouts, and informants were standard tactics, and the mafia had to develop countermeasures to operate safely. Carlo's experience and foresight allowed him to implement protocols that minimized the likelihood of exposure. He understood the importance of secrecy, avoiding predictable routines, and limiting knowledge of sensitive operations to those who had proven their loyalty. By controlling the flow of information, Carlo reduced the chances of infiltration, leaks, or inadvertent mistakes that could attract attention. This disciplined approach ensured that the organization could continue functioning efficiently while mitigating the growing law enforcement threat. Carlo also recognized the importance of perception in protecting himself from scrutiny. To the outside world, he maintained a low profile, appearing as an unassuming figure whose lifestyle and activities did not immediately suggest the breadth of his power. He avoided public confrontations, eschewed ostentation, and maintained the appearance of discretion in all dealings. This invisibility was strategic, reinforcing the difficulty investigators faced in connecting him to criminal operations directly. Even when others were arrested or publicly implicated, Carlo's careful insulation ensured that he remained a step ahead, his reputation intact and his influence unchallenged. A key aspect of Carlo's success in avoiding law enforcement pressure was his cultivation of loyalty and discretion among his inner circle. Lieutenants, associates, and allies were carefully selected for reliability, character, and understanding of the necessity of secrecy. Carlo invested in mentorship and trust building, emphasizing the importance of compliance, discretion, and adherence to protocols. By ensuring that those closest to him shared his commitment to operational security, Carlo minimized the risk of internal leaks, betrayal, or careless mistakes that could draw unwanted attention. Loyalty was both a protective shield and a mechanism for maintaining control, a lesson he had honed over decades of navigating complex networks and rivalries. Even in the face of increasing law enforcement sophistication, Carlo Gambino demonstrated remarkable foresight. He anticipated the evolution of investigative methods, the growing use of technology, and the potential vulnerabilities that could arise. He implemented subtle countermeasures, including indirect management of operations, coded communication, and reliance on trusted intermediaries. These strategies allowed him to continue exerting influence while reducing exposure, maintaining operational continuity, and safeguarding both his position and his organization. His ability to adapt to changing circumstances, anticipate threats, and implement protective measures was a hallmark of his strategic intelligence. The psychological dimension of law enforcement pressure was another aspect Carlo managed with skill. Investigators and prosecutors often attempted to provoke mistakes through surveillance, rumors, or attempts to exploit rivalries. Carlo's calm, measured demeanor, combined with his meticulous attention to operational security, allowed him to remain unflappable in the face of these pressures. Associates were aware of the importance of restraint and compliance, understanding that even small errors could have cascading consequences. By maintaining discipline, patience, and composure, Carlo reduced both the likelihood of law enforcement success and the internal stress that such scrutiny could produce. Carlo's understanding of law enforcement extended beyond reactive measures, it was proactive and anticipatory. He studied patterns of investigation, assessed risk factors, and identified potential vulnerabilities in his operations. This foresight allowed him to adjust tactics, restructure networks, and preemptively mitigate threats before they could be exploited. His strategic foresight was not merely operational, it was also psychological, shaping the perceptions of investigators, associates, and rivals alike. Carlo cultivated an aura of unpredictability and subtle authority, ensuring that even those who sought to understand or challenge him remained uncertain about his methods, reach, and intentions. The increasing attention from law enforcement also reinforced Carlo's broader philosophy of leadership, that power is most effectively exercised with discretion, foresight, and patience. He did not need to confront authorities directly or engage in overt acts of defiance, he relied on careful planning, strategic delegation, and the cultivation of loyalty and discretion to protect both himself and his empire. This approach allowed him to navigate an increasingly hostile environment with minimal disruption, maintaining control, stability, and influence without exposing himself unnecessarily. Carlo Gambino's strategies during this period exemplified the integration of operational intelligence, psychological insight, and disciplined execution. By compartmentalizing operations, cultivating loyalty, controlling information, and maintaining discretion, he created an organizational structure resilient to law enforcement pressure. Simultaneously, his reputation for calm, strategic decision-making reinforced both internal cohesion and external caution. Rivals and associates alike understood the stability and discipline of his leadership, while investigators found it difficult to penetrate the layers of subtle influence, discretion, and operational insulation he had established. Even as surveillance intensified and investigative methods grew more sophisticated, Carlo remained several steps ahead. His empire continued to function efficiently, alliances remained strong, and operations remained profitable. The subtlety, foresight, and discipline that had defined his rise to power now served as protective mechanisms, ensuring the durability of both his authority and his organization. Carlo's ability to balance the pressures of law enforcement with the demands of leadership demonstrated not only strategic genius but also an extraordinary capacity for patience, observation, and measured action. By the early 1970s, Carlo Gambino had successfully navigated an era of growing law enforcement scrutiny, maintaining both personal security and organizational stability. His methods, rooted in decades of experience, observation, and strategic thought, allowed him to operate effectively while minimizing exposure, protecting his inner circle, and ensuring the continuity of his empire. In doing so, he exemplified the power of foresight, discretion, and patient planning, proving that in a world of increasing scrutiny and potential danger, subtle mastery, loyalty, and strategic intelligence were more enduring than aggression, spectacle, or impulsive action. In the shadowed corridors of power, where decisions shaped empires and a single misstep could be fatal, Carlo Gambino understood that personal health and lifestyle were not merely private matters, they were strategic assets, integral to the exercise of authority and the sustainability of influence. Unlike many of his contemporaries, whose excesses often led to vulnerability or premature downfall, Carlo cultivated habits that reinforced his physical and mental resilience. His daily routines were measured, his diet and environment carefully controlled, and his personal discipline extended into every facet of life. The careful balance of strength, observation, and endurance allowed him to navigate the complex pressures of leadership over decades, a quiet testament to the foresight that had defined his career from its earliest stages. Picture a morning in Carlo Gambino's home, soft light filtering through curtains, a serene domestic environment insulated from the chaos of the streets outside. Even in the comfort of privacy, he maintained rituals that grounded him, fostering clarity and focus for the decisions that awaited him. Meals were nutritious and consistent, consumed with the deliberate mindfulness that characterized his approach to life. Physical activity was incorporated subtly but regularly, ensuring that his body remained strong enough to endure long hours, intense negotiations, and the occasional physical demands of his environment. These seemingly ordinary habits were anything but incidental, they were the foundation for a life in which stamina, composure, and alertness were paramount. Mental acuity was equally central to Carlo's maintenance of power. He practiced a form of quiet reflection, taking time to assess the consequences of past actions and anticipate future developments. This contemplative approach allowed him to integrate complex information, weigh risks, and consider the motivations and tendencies of allies, rivals, and potential adversaries. The ability to think several steps ahead, to simulate potential scenarios in his mind, and to anticipate reactions before they occurred was not merely an intellectual exercise, it was a survival mechanism, honed over decades of careful observation and disciplined practice. By maintaining both mental clarity and physical resilience, Carlo ensured that he could operate at the highest level of effectiveness for years longer than many of his peers. Carlo's lifestyle also emphasized balance and discretion. He avoided the excesses that could compromise judgment, impair decision-making, or attract unnecessary attention. While his contemporaries sometimes indulged in ostentatious displays of wealth, alcohol, or other vices that could weaken their authority or create vulnerability, Carlo's habits were controlled and purposeful. This restraint reinforced both his personal longevity and the perception of his composure. Associates, rivals, and even investigators perceived him as disciplined, unflappable, and deliberate, a man whose calm exterior mirrored his internal mastery. This perception alone became a protective factor, enhancing his influence without requiring confrontation or display. Sleep and rest were treated as strategic priorities. Carlo understood that fatigue could impair judgment, slow reaction times, and create openings for rivals or errors in judgment. Even in the midst of crises, he preserved time for restorative rest, ensuring that his mind remained sharp and his decisions measured. The careful integration of rest, nutrition, physical conditioning, and reflection created a rhythm of life that supported both resilience and strategic thinking. In a world where impulsivity and exhaustion could be fatal, Carlo's disciplined approach allowed him to maintain control and composure under pressures that would overwhelm others. Social interactions were managed with equal discretion and purpose. Carlo Gambino cultivated a circle of confidants whose loyalty and competence were unquestioned. Within this circle, he could share concerns, gather intelligence, and test ideas without fear of betrayal. These relationships provided not only practical operational support but also emotional and psychological stability. By surrounding himself with trusted allies and carefully limiting exposure to potential disruptors, Carlo reduced stress, maintained focus, and preserved the integrity of both his personal and professional life. Loyalty, in this sense, became both a social and strategic safeguard. Carlo's attention to health extended to preventive measures and careful monitoring. He was mindful of medical care, addressing issues before they became debilitating, and maintaining routines that supported long-term vitality. This proactive approach was a reflection of his broader philosophy: anticipate challenges before they arise, manage risks quietly and consistently, and integrate foresight into every aspect of life. By applying the same strategic thinking to his health that he applied to his empire, Carlo created a foundation for longevity that allowed him to wield influence steadily over decades, far beyond the reach of those whose excesses or neglect hastened their decline. The integration of health and strategy also influenced Carlo's psychological resilience. A strong, rested body supports a clear mind, and a disciplined routine reinforces emotional stability. Carlo's ability to remain calm under pressure, navigate disputes with subtlety, and maintain composure during law enforcement scrutiny was in part rooted in these physical and mental habits. By ensuring that his body and mind were aligned, he could approach high-stakes decisions with confidence, clarity, and patience, maintaining a presence of authority that discouraged dissent, challenged rivals, and reassured allies. Carlo's lifestyle also allowed him to maintain a sense of equilibrium in the face of unpredictable crises. In moments of high tension, whether internal disputes, rival challenges, or external pressure from authorities, his body's conditioning and his mind's preparedness enabled him to respond with composure. While others might act impulsively under stress, Carlo's approach was measured, deliberate, and strategically advantageous. The stability derived from his disciplined habits extended beyond physical endurance, influencing perception, decision-making, and long-term sustainability of power. In addition, Carlo Gambino's longevity and health allowed him to think in decades rather than years. While rivals and contemporaries often pursued short-term gains or immediate displays of power, Carlo's endurance enabled him to implement strategies with patience, to cultivate relationships over extended periods, and to respond to challenges with foresight rather than reaction. His capacity to maintain influence across generations was directly tied to his personal discipline, providing him with both the time and clarity to outmaneuver competitors, adapt to changing environments, and consolidate authority systematically. Carlo's attention to lifestyle and health also reinforced his image within his network. Associates and lieutenants observed not only his physical vitality but also the calmness and precision with which he managed operations. This consistency reinforced their confidence in his judgment, enhanced loyalty, and contributed to a perception of invulnerability. In many ways, the way he lived became a strategic extension of his leadership, the physical embodiment of discipline, patience, and foresight that underpinned his quiet mastery of the underworld. Even as he aged, Carlo Gambino remained vigilant, disciplined, and attentive to the routines and habits that sustained him. His approach was neither rigid nor obsessive, it was purposeful, integrating both personal well-being and strategic necessity. The interplay of health, resilience, and foresight became a silent but essential pillar of his enduring influence, enabling him to operate effectively in a world defined by volatility, competition, and threat. Through these deliberate habits, he ensured that his power remained not only immediate but also sustainable across decades, reinforcing the quiet stability and strategic mastery that defined his leadership. By the 1970s, Carlo Gambino's disciplined approach to personal health, lifestyle, and longevity was inseparable from his effectiveness as a leader. The rituals, routines, and measured behaviors that governed his private life reinforced his professional influence, ensuring resilience, clarity, and the capacity to navigate complex challenges. In this way, his attention to personal well-being was not merely a private concern, it was an essential component of strategic mastery. Carlo Gambino's life demonstrated that true power is not only exercised through networks, alliances, and authority but is also sustained through the careful maintenance of mind, body, and balance, an enduring testament to the intersection of personal discipline and long-term strategic success.